Scouts spent years learning to read terrain, not just for what it was, but for what it could do. They developed an almost instinctive ability to assess any landscape for defensive advantages within seconds of entering it. Consider the technique called terrain channeling. A scout being pursued wouldn't simply run away. He would run toward terrain that naturally funneled his pursuers into predictable paths while offering him multiple escape options. Example: a scout spots a war party approaching. Instead of fleeing directly away, he moves toward a rocky area where large boulders create natural corridors between them. As pursuers enter this terrain, they're forced to separate, to move single file through gaps between rocks, to lose sight of each other. Meanwhile, the scout, who has already identified 3 different exit routes from this boulder field, can choose his departure based on where pursuers position themselves. He might even double back, using the rocks for concealment, exiting the boulder field from the same direction he entered, while pursuers search deeper into the maze. Another technique involved what scouts called elevation deception. When pursued uphill, an experienced scout would crest the ridge and immediately move laterally along the opposite slope rather than continuing downhill. Pursuers cresting the ridge would naturally look downhill, expecting to see their quarry descending. They'd spot movement in that direction: deer, elk, wind-blown brush, and pursue it. Meanwhile, the scout moved parallel to the ridge line, eventually circling behind his pursuers. Water provided perhaps the most versatile terrain defense. Scouts use streams and rivers in ways that seem almost magical in their effectiveness. The basic technique was simple: enter water, walk upstream or downstream for significant distance, exit on same side you entered but far from entry point, then cut back toward your original direction of travel on dry land. Pursuers, finding where you entered the water, would split forces, some going upstream, some downstream, searching both banks for exit point. But you'd exited on the near side, the side they'd already searched, in a location they'd already passed. By the time they realized the deception, you'd be miles away. More sophisticated water techniques involved using creek beds as highways. A scout could walk up a shallow stream for miles, leaving no tracks, emerging at multiple points to check back trail, then re-entering water to continue. Pursuers faced an impossible tracking problem. Every spot where the stream bank showed no tracks could be the exit point, forcing them to search exhaustively while their quarry gained distance. Some scouts became legendary for their ability to use water as defensive terrain. Kit Carson reportedly once evaded a Comanche war party by entering the Arkansas River and floating downstream for nearly 3 miles, breathing through a hollow reed while the current carried him past his pursuers who searched the banks. Marshes and swamps, while dangerous, provided similar advantages. Most pursuers avoided these areas due to difficulty of movement and danger of becoming mired. Scouts who learned the safe paths through marshland could disappear into terrain where others feared to follow. Rocky terrain offered concealment advantages that scouts exploited ruthlessly. A man lying flat behind a rock is invisible from 10 feet away. A man moving from rock to rock, timing his movements when pursuers look elsewhere, can cross terrain that seems impossibly open. The technique required extraordinary patience. A scout might spend 30 minutes moving 30 yards, advancing only when absolutely certain no eyes were watching his position. But this patience allowed crossing terrain that pursuers assumed was too exposed for escape. Forest environments provided different advantages. Scouts learned which vegetation types allowed quiet movement and which betrayed presence through noise. They memorized which trees had low branches suitable for climbing, offering vertical escape when horizontal movement became impossible. One documented technique involved climbing a tree immediately after being spotted, then remaining absolutely motionless while pursuers searched the ground below. Human psychology works against looking up. People instinctively search at their own eye level and below, rarely above. A scout who could control his breathing and remain perfectly still could watch pursuers pass directly beneath his position. Dense vegetation offered similar advantages. A scout who dropped flat in tall grass or heavy brush became effectively invisible to anyone more than 15 feet away. Pursuers might walk within arm's reach without spotting a man lying motionless in thick cover. The key to all terrain manipulation was pre-planning. Scouts constantly assessed their environment for defensive options. They noted escape routes, concealment positions, terrain features that could be exploited. They never moved through territory without understanding how they'd evade pursuit if discovered. This constant awareness created what modern military terminology would call situational awareness, a comprehensive understanding of your environment and how to use it. For frontier scouts, this awareness wasn't optional. It was survival. Frontier scouts understood something most people overlook: sound shapes perception more powerfully than sight. What you hear determines where you look, what you expect to see, how you interpret ambiguous visual information. This understanding led to sophisticated acoustic deception techniques that scouts used to misdirect, confuse, and completely disorient pursuers. The rock-throwing technique Jacob Riis used wasn't random. It exploited a fundamental human response. We orient toward sudden sounds. That orientation creates tunnel vision, intense focus on the sound source while peripheral awareness collapses. Scouts use this ruthlessly. When being tracked, a well-placed thrown object could cause pursuers to converge on empty terrain, creating opportunities for the scout to move through now-abandoned areas or slip behind the searchers. But sophisticated scouts use sound much more subtly. They learned to imitate animal sounds so convincingly that pursuers would dismiss scout-generated noises as wildlife. Every frontier scout could reproduce basic bird calls: crow caws, turkey gobbles, hawk screams. These served dual purposes. First, they provided communication methods with other scouts that enemies would interpret as natural forest sounds. Second, they could be used to mask human noises. Example: a scout needs to cross terrain where dried leaves make silent movement impossible. He waits until wind gusts through the trees, then moves during the wind noise. But if wind is absent, he can create his own acoustic cover. A crow's sudden alarm call draws attention upward, to the sky, to the treetops. During that moment of upward focus, the scout makes his noisy movement across the leaves. Pursuers hear the leaves rustle. They've just heard a crow alarm call, so they interpret the leaf noise as the crow's departure, not human movement. More advanced scouts learned larger animal sounds. Elk bugling, deer snorting, bear grunts, all could be used to suggest large animal presence in specific locations, causing pursuers to avoid those areas or approach them with excessive caution that slowed pursuit. One particularly effective technique involved imitating a mountain lion scream. This sound, a horrifying shriek that sounds almost human, causes instinctive fear responses in humans and horses. A scout who could produce this sound convincingly could stampede pursuers' horses, create panic in pursuing groups, or simply cause enemies to abandon pursuit entirely in favor of seeking safer territory. Wolves provided another acoustic tool. Scouts learned to howl convincingly enough to suggest wolf pack presence. Since wolves follow game herds and avoid large human groups, a scout could use wolf howls to suggest that game animals, and therefore the scout being tracked, had moved in specific directions. Pursuers following game trails would pursue the false direction, while the scout moved elsewhere. The wilderness itself provided natural sound sources that scouts exploited. Water sounds, streams, rivers, waterfalls, mask other noises completely. A scout being pursued toward water would use the approaching sound to mask his own movement, knowing that as pursuers got closer to the water, their ability to hear his escape diminished. Wind through trees created similar opportunities. Scouts learned to recognize wind patterns, to predict when gusts would sweep through an area. They timed risky movements, crossing open areas, moving through noisy terrain, to coincide with these wind sounds. Thunder provided the ultimate acoustic cover. During storms, scouts could move almost carelessly, knowing that thunder would mask even loud noises. Some scouts deliberately waited for storms to conduct risky movements, using weather as an ally. But perhaps the most psychologically powerful acoustic technique involved creating phantom sounds that suggested presence where the scout wasn't. A branch bent and released at the right moment would snap back with sound suggesting someone moving through brush. A rock dislodged on a slope would rattle downhill, suggesting someone descending. A stick balanced precariously would eventually fall, creating noise minutes or hours after the scout had departed. These delayed sounds could freeze pursuers in place, convinced their quarry was nearby, while the scout gained precious distance. Or they could pull pursuers toward false locations, splitting their forces, creating gaps in their search pattern. One documented account describes a scout named Thomas Fitzpatrick, who evaded a Gros Ventre war party by creating what he called a sound trail. As he moved through timber, he deliberately disturbed the environment in ways that would create delayed sounds, balanced rocks that would fall, bent branches that would snap back, piles of dried needles positioned to cascade downslope with the slightest disturbance. Over the next hour, as Fitzpatrick moved steadily away, these positioned disturbances created a series of sounds behind him, suggesting he was moving much slower than his actual pace. The war party followed the sound trail cautiously, expecting to overtake him quickly, while Fitzpatrick gained an insurmountable lead. Night amplified all these acoustic techniques. In darkness, sound becomes primary sense. Human hearing sharpens dramatically when vision is limited. Scouts operating at night use sound manipulation with even greater effectiveness. A classic night evasion technique involved moving during the target's own noise. When pursuers moved through camp, their own footsteps, conversations, and activities created acoustic cover. The scout would time his movements to coincide with these sounds, advancing whenever the camp was naturally noisy, freezing during quiet moments. Conversely, scouts learned absolute silence. They practiced moving without sound, rolling feet from heel to toe to distribute weight. Gradually, testing each footfall before committing weight, breathing through open mouths to avoid nasal whistle, wearing soft footwear that conformed to terrain rather than breaking vegetation. This silence wasn't just defensive, it was an intelligence-gathering tool. A scout who could approach an enemy camp silently could gather information impossible to obtain otherwise. The ability to move within earshot of enemies without detection was perhaps the scout's most valuable skill. The most powerful weapon frontier scouts wielded wasn't physical. It was psychological. They understood that human minds are prediction machines, constantly trying to anticipate danger, and that uncertainty is more terrifying than confirmed threat. Scouts used this understanding to create fear and hesitation in pursuers, buying time and creating opportunities for escape. The fundamental principle was simple. Humans fear what they don't understand, a mysterious event, an unexplained occurrence, something that doesn't fit expected patterns. These generate anxiety disproportionate to actual danger. Scouts exploited this ruthlessly. One technique involved leaving wrong signs, evidence that suggested impossible or supernatural events. A scout being tracked might deliberately leave tracks that appeared and disappeared mysteriously, suggested traveling in physically impossible directions, or indicated presence of something other than a normal human. Example: a scout walks backward in his own tracks for 50 yards, then steps off onto a rock, leaving no exit trail. Pursuers find tracks that lead to a spot and simply vanish with no indication where the track maker went. This creates uncertainty, superstitious fear, and, most importantly, causes pursuers to slow down, to search more carefully, to question whether they're tracking something they want to find. More elaborate versions involved staging scenes that suggested violence or danger. A scout might scatter his own belongings as if he'd been attacked, add animal blood from a previous kill to suggest injury, then disappear completely. Pursuers finding this scene would assume he'd been killed or injured by wildlife, potentially ending pursuit entirely. Some scouts carried items specifically for psychological manipulation. Small mirrors that could flash light at great distances, creating unexplained lights that suggested supernatural presence. Unusual objects left in prominent locations that enemies would find and puzzle over, wasting time and creating unease. The psychological technique called ghost signing involved creating evidence of presence without leaving clear tracks. A broken twig here, a displaced rock there, subtle signs that something had passed, but nothing clear enough to track effectively. This kept pursuers aware they were in the right area while preventing them from closing distance or predicting direction. More sinister was the practice of leaving signs that suggested the scout was aware of pursuers and watching them. A fresh mark on a tree visible from a pursuer's path, a rock arrangement that pointed toward the pursuer's position, footprints that circled around where the pursuers had been, all suggesting the scout wasn't fleeing but rather observing, potentially preparing an ambush. This reversal of roles, changing from hunted to hunter in the psychological space, often caused pursuers to abandon the chase. Men who believed they were being stalked became defensive, cautious, more concerned with their own safety than continuing pursuit. Night activities amplified psychological techniques. A scout operating near a hostile camp at night had numerous options for creating unease without direct confrontation. Moving around the camp perimeter, leaving tracks that would be found in morning, taking small items that would be missed, making subtle sounds that suggested presence without revealing location. All these created fear and uncertainty that could demoralize enemies and create opportunities. One account describes a scout named Jim Beckworth, who evaded capture by a Crow war party by circling back to their camp each night for 3 consecutive nights, leaving increasingly bold signs of his presence. First footprints at the camp perimeter, then evidence he'd been among their horses. Finally, a mark on the lodge of their leader suggesting he'd stood directly outside while they slept. The psychological impact was devastating. The warriors who'd been hunting him became fearful of camping, began arguing among each other about whether to continue pursuit, eventually disbanded the hunting party entirely. Beckworth had turned hunters into prey without violence. Fire created another psychological tool. Small fires left in unexpected locations suggested camp presence but revealed nothing when investigated. Smoke signals in areas where no people should be generated confusion. Extinguished fires that were still warm suggested the scout was minutes ahead, creating false hope that drove pursuers to exhaustion trying to close the gap. Animal remains positioned deliberately could suggest various scenarios. Bones arranged in patterns implied ritualistic or supernatural activity. Fresh kills left partially consumed suggested presence but provided no directional information. Tracks near kills suggested the scout had opportunities for ambush, causing pursuers to approach all terrain more cautiously. The ultimate psychological technique involved the scout presenting himself briefly to pursuers, then vanishing. A figure seen at distance, moving between rocks, then gone when pursuers reached the location. This confirmed pursuers were close, maintaining their motivation, while demonstrating the scout's ability to disappear at will, creating frustration and respect. This technique required enormous courage and perfect terrain knowledge. The scout had to expose himself briefly enough to be seen, but not long enough for weapons to be aimed. In terrain he'd already identified as offering perfect concealment once out of sight. Done successfully, it created a psychological dynamic where pursuers knew their quarry was near but couldn't close the final distance. After hours or days of this frustration, many pursuit parties simply gave up, concluding that catching this particular scout wasn't worth the effort. While terrain manipulation and psychological warfare created opportunities for escape, scouts also practiced active deception, deliberately creating false information that sent pursuers in wrong directions. The most basic form involved false trail creation. A scout would walk in one direction long enough to establish clear tracks, then backtrack in his own footprints before stepping off onto hard ground or water, leaving pursuers to follow a trail that ended nowhere. More sophisticated versions involve creating multiple false trails. From a single starting point, the scout would create 3 or 4 distinct paths leading in different directions. Pursuers would have to split forces to investigate each trail, weakening their numbers and creating opportunities for the scout to slip between the divided groups. Some scouts became artists at false trail creation, investing hours creating convincing tracks that led pursuers into difficult terrain, swamps, dense forests, steep slopes, where tracking became impossible, and pursuers emerged exhausted and demoralized. The tree-stepping technique was particularly effective. A scout would walk normal pace toward a tree, climb it, leaving minimal evidence, traverse through connected branches to another tree, descend, and continue in a completely different direction. Pursuers tracking the scout would reach the tree where tracks seemed to end and waste enormous time searching for exit tracks that didn't exist in the expected location. Animal tracks provided another deception tool. A scout could walk behind a deer or elk for distance, his tracks obscured by the animal's more prominent hoofprints. When the animal veered in one direction, the scout would continue another way, leaving pursuers to follow the animal's trail. Some scouts deliberately spooked game animals, causing them to run in specific directions. The fleeing animal would obliterate the scout's tracks while creating fresh tracks leading away from the scout's actual path. Horse tracks offered similar opportunities. A mounted scout being tracked by foot pursuers had enormous advantages, but even this could be enhanced through deception. Riding along rocky terrain where hoofprints were minimal, doubling back and riding through his own trail to confuse direction of travel, even dismounting and walking backward while leading the horse to reverse apparent direction. All these techniques multiplied the basic advantage of mounted travel. The camp abandonment deception was particularly effective for scouts operating in groups. The group would establish an obvious camp with fire, bedding, evidence of occupancy. Then they would depart carefully, covering their exit tracks. Pursuers finding the camp would assume the occupants were nearby, would search the surrounding area extensively, while the scouts had actually departed hours earlier. Some scouts elevated this into elaborate staging, leaving equipment that suggested hurried departure, creating tracks that suggested the camp had been abandoned in panic, even adding animal blood to suggest injury or attack. Each element reinforced the story that scouts were close, injured, vulnerable, while actually they were miles away and perfectly safe. Weather provided opportunities for false trail creation that were nearly undetectable. A scout traveling before a storm would leave tracks that would be erased by rain or snow. But before the weather hit, he could create false trails leading in wrong directions. When pursuers picked up the trail after the weather passed, they would find only the false trails, the true path having been erased, and follow deception rather than reality. Winter offered unique deception opportunities. Snow shows tracks clearly, but it also allows track manipulation. A scout could snowshoe in one direction, remove the snowshoes and walk back in the snowshoe tracks carrying them, then put them on again and depart in a completely different direction. The snowshoe tracks would lead to a point where they mysteriously ended, wasting pursuers' time. One technique, called shadow walking, involved following another traveler's tracks from behind, stepping precisely in their footprints, making it appear that only one person had passed rather than two. When the scout diverged from the original traveler, pursuers would continue following the original tracks, never realizing their actual target had departed the trail. River crossings allowed perhaps the most effective false trails. A scout could walk into water, wade downstream, then return to the near bank in a different location, creating the impression he crossed to the far bank, when actually he remained on the original side. More elaborate versions involved actually crossing the river, walking in clear view on the far bank to ensure tracks would be seen, then recrossing at a different point and continuing on the original side. Pursuers would cross the river following the false trail, wasting time and effort, while the scout moved away on the opposite bank. These techniques weren't instinctive. They required years of practice and learning from those who'd survived through their application. Young men entering scout service typically apprenticed with experienced scouts, learning through observation and supervised practice. A novice would accompany a veteran on missions, watching how he moved, what he noticed, how he responded to danger. Training emphasized patient observation over action. A common exercise involved the veteran and novice observing a landscape together, then the veteran asking the novice to describe what he'd seen. The novice might mention terrain features, vegetation types, obvious game trails. The veteran would then point out 50 additional details the novice had missed: the pattern of broken twigs suggesting game movement, the soil discoloration indicating water table depth, the specific tree species that offered best concealment, the wind patterns evident in how grass bent. This iterative process, repeated hundreds of times across varied terrain, trained scouts to see what others missed, to extract maximum information from minimum evidence. Physical training focused on movement skills. Scouts practiced crossing different terrain types silently, learning which surfaces could be crossed quickly and which required extreme care. They learned to move through thick vegetation without disturbing it visibly, to cross gravel without sound, to wade water without creating ripples that would mark their passage. Balance and body control received enormous attention. A scout had to move across uncertain terrain, logs, rocks, steep slopes, without stumbles or noise. They practiced moving in darkness, learning to trust their feet, to find safe placement without visual confirmation. Patience training was perhaps most challenging. Novices naturally wanted to move quickly, to cross dangerous areas as fast as possible. Veterans taught that speed created noise, that rushing caused mistakes, that the patient man who took an hour to cross terrain, the rushing man crossed in 10 minutes was the one who survived. One classic training exercise involved the veteran and novice entering thick vegetation, the veteran hiding, and the novice attempting to find him. The veteran might be 20 feet away, perfectly visible if you looked directly at him, but invisible to someone moving too quickly or looking carelessly. After the novice gave up searching, the veteran would reveal his position, teaching the lesson that observation required time and care. Sound discipline training began with simple exercises, moving across dried leaves without noise, approaching animals closely enough to touch them without causing flight, stalking other scouts through the forest without being detected. These skills, once mastered, transferred directly to evading human pursuit. Psychological training involved learning to read human behavior, predict responses, understand how enemies would interpret evidence. Veterans would create scenarios describing a pursuit situation and ask novices how they would respond. They'd critique the responses, explaining why certain choices would succeed and others would fail. Memory training emphasized route recall. Scouts had to remember terrain they'd crossed, able to navigate back to specific locations days or weeks later. They practiced describing landmarks from memory, drawing maps of terrain they'd traversed, identifying locations from verbal descriptions. Weather awareness received constant attention. Scouts learned to predict weather changes hours in advance by reading clouds, wind patterns, animal behavior. This knowledge allowed planning movements around weather events, traveling before storms to erase tracks using wind for sound cover, avoiding exposure during dangerous weather. The training never truly ended. Even experienced scouts constantly learned, adapted their techniques, incorporated new methods. The frontier environment changed. Tribes moved, game patterns shifted, terrain features altered, requiring continuous adaptation. The non-lethal defense strategies developed by frontier scouts didn't die with the frontier. They evolved into modern military tactics still taught today. Military evasion and escape training, taught to pilots, special forces, intelligence personnel, incorporates many techniques directly descended from frontier scout methods. The emphasis on terrain exploitation, the use of deception rather than confrontation, the psychological manipulation of pursuers, all these trace back to the wilderness scouts of the 1800s. Modern guerrilla warfare tactics show clear lineage from scout techniques. The emphasis on avoiding direct confrontation, the use of terrain to negate enemy advantages, the focus on intelligence gathering over combat. These principles that scouts perfected in the Rockies became foundational concepts in 20th century insurgent warfare. Survival training for outdoor enthusiasts incorporates many scout techniques. Learning to move through wilderness without leaving a trace, understanding how to use terrain for concealment, developing observation skills. These are skills that recreational hikers and hunters now study, descended from methods developed by men whose lives depended on them. Law enforcement tracking and counter-tracking techniques draw heavily on scout knowledge. Understanding how pursued individuals might create false trails, recognizing deception attempts, reading terrain for concealment possibilities. These skills that modern search and rescue personnel use originated with frontier scouts. Even modern psychology acknowledges principles scouts understood intuitively. The power of environmental manipulation to shape perception, the effectiveness of uncertainty in creating anxiety, the way human attention can be directed through sensory cues. Academic psychology now documents what scouts practiced 2 centuries ago. The fundamental insight remains valid. The most effective defense isn't always the most violent. Sometimes the best weapon is the one you never use. Sometimes survival depends not on fighting harder, but on thinking smarter. Frontier scouts understood this instinctively. They operated in an environment where every confrontation risked death, where ammunition was precious, where the mission mattered more than personal glory. They developed methods that prioritized survival over victory, completion over combat. Their legacy isn't in the battles they fought. Most fought very few. Their legacy is in the missions they completed, the information they returned with, the lives they preserved by choosing cunning over courage, deception over direct action. They proved that the human mind, properly trained and creatively applied, could overcome tremendous physical disadvantages, that knowledge, observation, and tactical thinking could defeat superior numbers and firepower, that the scout who returned with intelligence was worth more than the warrior who died gloriously in combat. In an era that celebrated martial courage and direct confrontation, frontier scouts represented a different philosophy, one that valued results over recognition, survival over sacrifice, and intelligence over aggression. Their techniques seem almost magical, men disappearing into empty terrain, creating false realities that deceived pursuers, manipulating environments and perceptions to create advantages from nothing. But there was no magic, just knowledge, practice, patience, and the understanding that the most dangerous weapon wasn't carried in their hands. It was carried between their ears. The frontier is gone. The scouts who mastered these techniques have passed into history, but their methods remain relevant. The principles they understood, that terrain offers advantages to those who understand it, that sound shapes perception, that psychology influences behavior, that deception can be more effective than direct action. These principles transcend time and technology. In any environment where conflict exists, where danger must be evaded, where survival depends on cunning rather than strength, the lessons of frontier scouts remain applicable. The specifics change: modern urban environments rather than wilderness, electronic surveillance rather than visual tracking. But the fundamental concepts endure. The mind remains the most powerful weapon. Terrain, properly understood, provides endless defensive advantages. Deception, skillfully applied, defeats superior force. Patience outlasts aggression. These truths that frontier scouts proved with their lives continue teaching us how to survive when confronted with overwhelming odds, how to accomplish missions despite opposition, how to return home when others would perish. That's the legacy of frontier scouts. Not glory, not recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of completing the mission and surviving to undertake the next one, using nothing but knowledge, terrain, and the most powerful weapon ever devised, the human mind.